Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the African American Workshop and Lecture Series. We thank you so much for joining us tonight for another wonderful presentation in the University of Oregon's African American Workshop and Lecture Series. And as you will recall, the series is one of the 12 demands of the Black Student Task Force. And the purpose of the series is to facilitate a better understanding of and appreciation for the vast contributions that Black people have made to our country and our world. Get ready to get ready. Tonight's speaker is a gifted and inspiring scientist and leader in the United States and abroad. And he will be introduced by our president, who is a wonderful supporter of the African American Speaker and Workshop Lecture Series. Our provost, Patrick Phillips, will be in charge of moderating the question and answer portion of our discussion. And as this is the final speaker in our series for the year, I want to extend a big round of appreciation to Angelique Brooks and Kenley Pimbleton, who are our staff colleagues responsible for all of the background work that makes these events possible. When you see them on campus, virtually, and in living color, please join me in extending your appreciation as well. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming President Michael Schill, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It is really my pleasure to welcome you to a very special African American Workshop and Lecture Series event. And I want to start by thanking Yvette and thanking Kelly and Anjali. Thank you so much for this. This has been the best workshop, I think. I've been in academics for, 35, 40 years. No, it's not 40, thank goodness, but 35 years. And I got to tell you, this is the best workshop series I've ever been invited to or been part of. Our discussion today features the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Freeman Hrabowski, who will speak about how institutions of higher education can support student success through shared leadership and cultural empowerment. Now, it is an honor to have President Robowsky with us tonight. He is a nationally recognized leader in higher education. He's an innovator in helping students realize their potential and find success in their academic pursuits. Let me tell you a little bit about him. A child and leader of the civil rights movement, President Hrabowski's commitment to social justice can be traced back to his childhood in Birmingham, Alabama. At the age of 12, he joined the Children's Crusade March for Civil Rights and spent 5 days and nights in jail comforting other young freedom marchers after they were swept up in a mass arrest. Perhaps equal to his passion for equity and inclusion is his interest in and love of science and mathematics. As a university student, he noticed that many of his classmates didn't excel in the way that he did in math classes. And by the time he began his master's degree, he was the only Black student in his classes. Curious and inspired, he established a tutoring center for African American high school and college students in math and science courses. After earning his PhD, he stayed at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana as an assistant professor and assistant dean. He held positions at Alabama A&M University and the University of Maryland before becoming president of UMBC in 1992. So he's been president for 30 years. Now, under his leadership, UMBC has been nationally recognized as an inclusive model for academic and pedagogical excellence. He is credited with the creation of the Meyerhoff Scholars Program. That program is open to all high-achieving students committed to pursuing future careers in science and engineering. President Robowsky graduated from Hampton Institute with a BA in mathematics, earned his master's in math and PhD in higher education administration and Statistics from the University of Illinois. As an administrator and a leader, he has aimed to ensure that students of all backgrounds continue to achieve success in STEM fields, as well as other academic initiatives. He's the recipient of tons of distinguished accolades, honorary degrees from more than 40 institutions. His most recent publication, The Empowered University, Shared Leadership, Culture Change, and Academic Success, is the focal point of tonight's conversation. And I read a number of articles, and I read this book, and my dog sort of gnawed around the edges too. And it's a great read and a really, really important book. And I had the pleasure with Patrick Phillips of talking with Freeman earlier today and learned a ton. So now it's a chance for you all to learn a ton. And I'm delighted to introduce and welcome President Freeman Hrabowski. Freeman?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you this evening. And I want to thank everyone from Yvette and Michael and Patrick and others that I met with today, Black faculty and staff and students. And I heard several things that are very significant. That yes, there are challenges for minorities on your campus. Yes, there's a need to disaggregate data and look at what experiences different groups are having. But something that I heard that was very special is that even with all the challenges, that people tend to stay, that they stay at the university and they stay in the state. And so as I begin, I want you to think about the role that you play as a public university in your state for attracting talent from beyond the walls of Oregon, from beyond the boundaries, and for increasing the numbers of people from diverse backgrounds who become leaders and residents in that state of Oregon. And so I begin with poetry. It is, when William Carlos Williams once said, it's difficult to find news in poetry, and yet men and women die miserably every day because of a lack of what's found there. And so I begin with words from the beloved and now late Maya Angelou, who spoke to our country almost 30 years ago at the installation of another president and said, lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it, this dream, into the palms of your hands. Mold it into the image of your most public self. Sculpt it into the shape of your most private need. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face and say simply, very simply with hope, good morning. And I say to you, good evening. And here in Baltimore, it's good night in many ways. I'm delighted to be here, and I want you to think about stories. You know, I am in Baltimore at UMBC. We are a mid-sized public research university. We are an honors institution in that we achieve quite a bit because we bring in very serious students, high-achieving serious students of all races. We become a model for inclusive excellence. And it's a population that's probably half and half, about 50% white and about 50% of color, with the Asian population being largest, actually, with about 25%, with about 18 or 19% Black, and then Latinx and a few Native Americans. And with students from around the country, but with students from 100 countries. And with more than half of my students, almost 60%, who have a parent from another country. And they are military families, intelligence families, people who come here to grad school. And that is our environment. But I grew up in Birmingham, as Michael said, and we in the Deep South love stories. We like to weave a story. Baltimore is the Upper South. But in the Deep South, we really tell these stories. And so just a little more of the meat on the skeleton of what he said earlier, that I was sitting in the back of church at 12, and I heard this pastor say in the middle of the week, I didn't want to be there, that if the children participate in this peaceful protest, all of America will understand that even our young people know the difference between right and wrong. And I was really not wanting to be there. My parents were placating me with the two things I loved most, mathematics. I've always gotten goosebumps doing math. And I was eating. They always encouraged me. So I was eating M&Ms, the good kind with the peanuts, for the students in the audience. And all of a sudden I heard him say that. And he said, and they'll be able to go to better schools. And I said, who is this guy? And of course, his name was Dr. King. And I did go to jail after some concerns from my parents. and it was an empowering week. It was a horrific week. We were treated like animals, like slaves, on the floor, not enough restrooms, hundreds of children, and it was very frightening. But in the middle of the week, Dr. King came, and all the kids there in jail, after peacefully protesting, simply wanted a better education. And he said, what you do this day will have an impact on children who've not yet been born. And we didn't understand the profundity, but we sensed that this was something special. And I tell you that story because shortly after that, after the tragedy of the 4 little girls in Birmingham being bombed, after the tragedy of the assassination of President Kennedy, we find ourselves with legislation led by a Southerner, Lyndon Johnson, the master of the Senate. And so we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1965 Higher Education Act. And all of a sudden, the world changed dramatically. I should tell you that few people understand how small the numbers were of people going to college in the 60s. In fact, if I were there, I'd ask you that question. But just think about it for a minute. What percent of Americans had graduated from college in 1965? You might be surprised to know it was only 10%. For blacks, it was only 3 to 4%. For whites, only 11%. So what I'm telling you is in the mid-60s, 90% of Americans really didn't expect their kids to go to college. But we had that Higher Education Act, and a few years later, the Pell Grants Act. And so people without money had opportunities more than ever to go to college. My campus was founded in the 60s, along with a number of other universities, as America began to think about increasing the number of Americans who would get a college degree. There are 2 people who are there at University of Oregon. Not sure they're with the audience tonight, but I wanted to mention them for a special reason. The first is one of your professors emeriti. His name is Jim Moore, M-O-H-R. He left my campus after being chair of history there as I was becoming president, but we'd worked together for 5 years. I'd seen the impact of him on our campus, and he worked at your campus since '92. And became a distinguished professor in social sciences and a Philip Knight professor of social sciences, I believe, and in history. And the significance is that he helped to lay the foundation for the culture that I talk about today on our campus, the intellectual foundation, as well as an understanding of the need to bring in students of all types. And so he is a giant on our campus still. We still remember his report, the Moore Report. And the other person has come to live there recently after leaving the DC area and could be a major resource. His name is Dr. Cliff Pudrey. Cliff is American Indian who grew up born in Buffalo, but became a full professor of biology at Santa Cruz, then came to the federal government and worked at NSF, NIH, and HHMI, and was very helpful to us with the development of the MILE program that I'll talk about tonight. Most important, he is one of the thought leaders in the country on the development of scientists with a special emphasis on minorities. And I would strongly, I just told the president and provost, they should get in contact because he can be very helpful to you in this process. Excuse me. And so think about the fact that I've told you that only about 10% of Americans in the 60s had a college degree. Today, we're up to 30%. And we break it down by the different racial groups. And it's always important to disaggregate the data. And so it might not surprise you to hear that we've gotten up to 23% of blacks with a college degree, 4-year degree. For Hispanics, Latinos, it's still only about 15%. Native Americans is below that, American Indians. And then that the white population is still only 38%. And the Asian population is slightly over 50%, though some groups of Asians are not with those statistics. Why do I tell you that? You put it together, 2/3 of Americans today still haven't had anyone in the family graduate from college. And the greatest potential we have in our country is to increase the numbers of people with both 2-year degrees and 4-year degrees. And so for many people who are educated, who are not around regular people or people who may not have gone to college, it's hard to believe that the vast majority of Americans still haven't had that college experience. Why do I tell you that? Well, as I talk today about performance in college and the notion of culture, and as I talk about this book that we've written, the Empowered University, I want you to think about who you are as an institution at the University of Oregon. And this is going to be conversational after a few points because I really want to get into questions. The Empowered University focuses on our campus, some broad national statistics of the type I just mentioned, the idea of culture. You might not know it, but one group of people fought the GI Bill in the 40s as a larger context as we think about what happened in the 60s. And very few people will get it. If I ask you, what group would you think would fight the idea of veterans being given support to go to college? And if you think about it, you may have some guesses. It was college presidents, starting with the presidents of Harvard and Chicago, the most intellectually admired in the country, in the world. Were they bad people, bad men? No. They were products of their childhood experiences. They thought that college was for people of privilege. They thought that necessarily veterans should go into a trade. And yet, a couple of million veterans ended up taking advantage of what FDR had put in place with the GI Bill. And before we knew it, we were seeing large numbers of veterans getting degrees, moving into the middle class. And so by the time the Higher Education Act came in the 60s, people believed that regular people could get a college degree. Now, still, we limited the number of blacks. Very few blacks were able to take advantage of that. And we had too few women who were taking advantage. But even regular white men were kept out because that was not thought to be the place for regular people somehow. I tell you that because our book focuses on culture change. Eric Weiner, in his book, The Geography of Bliss, says that culture is the sea we swim in, so all-consuming that we fail to recognize it until we step out of it and look back to see what we see. And so when I talk about the Empowered University, we're talking about empowering institutions, universities, to be honest with self, to be challenged to look in the mirror, to appreciate what they have that is working well, their strengths, but to be honest about the way to go, how much more to be done. The line we use at UMBC is success is never final. We always have more to do. We've been fortunate in all the ratings, regardless of what you think about methodologies, to be honored for being the top 10 in innovation, top 10 in undergrad education, and with excellence in research in selected areas, not trying to be all things to all people, which was a part of what Jim Moore helped us to think through of who we are going to be. We didn't want to be simply the other big campus in the state, but rather what are we known for? And that's the question to you, I would ask. And so what I want you to think about is this notion of what does culture mean? It is the essence of who we are. It is the questions we ask, the responses. It is the incentives we have for doing things. It is what we frown upon, what we really like to see. It's what we celebrate. It's what we don't want to talk about. It simply will be the values that we hold. And my essential point today is that the way we think about ourselves, the language that we use, the way we interact with each other, the level of honesty in the communication will shape not only who we are today, but who we as individuals, as a university, as a society will be in the years to come. And so much of my research has focused on performance in science, because there are two things going on here. One is in our country, almost half of students do not graduate. The fact is that while we say it's between 55 and 60%, that distribution is very bimodal. In the most prestigious institutions, often private, some very wealthy public institutions, we may get to 90-some% graduating, but large percentages of institutions of all types will have below 40% graduating. And you have that. So we say in the middle, 50 to 60, but we've got this real challenge. The richer the institution, the richer the people, the greater the probability they will graduate. And the challenge we face as middle-class institutions, quite frankly, is to help many more graduate. And when I talk, I should say, so in the book, we talk about the fact that in the late 80s, our graduation rate 6 year was only 35, 40%, not even 40%. Today, it's at 70%. But we can tell you where 20% of the additional students are because they go to the professional schools in certain programs, or they went to programs we don't have. And so we're still working to get the numbers up, but we can tell you where they are. You are in the mid 60s for the most part. Your minority populations, though, are at least 10 percentage points below. And that is one of your challenges in general. We take pride in saying that now our minority populations, Black and Latino, have graduation rates some years that are slightly higher than the white graduation rates. And we've worked on that issue to move all of those up. But the problem that we have that is most challenging in our country, besides needing to help more people graduate, besides needing to figure out what it means to be a citizen and to do what you've heard people from Phi Beta Kappa have said. Fred Lawrence, the secretary of Phi Beta Kappa, says that our goal in universities should be to teach our students, of course, to be good citizens. But what does that mean? It is to be able to present their arguments and back them up with fact and evidence, critical thinking, to be able to listen to other perspectives without getting angry, and calmly to analyze the evidence presented by other perspectives, and to seek the common ground. We talk a lot about that common ground, and we could spend the entire night talking about what that should mean for the country. But I bring that up because as I think about our challenges right now, the graduation rate, teaching students to think, listening to evidence, one of our major challenges comes in the STEM areas, which I'd said that I would talk about because we do so poorly as a country. If it were not for people coming from other nations to go to grad school here, we would have a serious problem with the scientific infrastructure in our country. I know this because we're in the Baltimore-Washington corridor. We are partners with the National Security Agency. Large numbers of my students are from military families, intelligence families, some from diplomatic families. But I tell you that because the fact is that as a country, we call the first year or two of science weed out courses. You know that. I was privileged to chair both the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Underrepresentation almost 10 years ago. And that looks at minorities, but we also look at women and particular challenges for women in certain areas such as computing, engineering, and others. Women are doing better in the life sciences. But for minorities, we still have particularly underrepresented groups, Blacks and Latinx, or Native Americans. We have the percentages are very small. The percent of scientists in all of our national agencies, of all the national agencies with thousands and thousands of scientists at NIH, NSA, NASA, all these places, in most, under 1% of those scientists are Black. And at NIH, it's still under 2%, even with health disparities. And similarly for Latinx, we're talking about 3 or 4% for all types of Hispanic groups. And so we know, given the rising percentages of those populations in the larger population, we have a challenge if we're to remain competitive. Only 5% of the bachelors in our country are awarded to people in natural sciences and engineering. In Europe, it's almost 11%. And so again, the fact that bringing in people from other countries, which I think we should still continue to do as much as possible, we need all the brain power we can get, but we have to find ways to educate people of all races who are born of the soil and who are here. And when I looked at your data, and I want to commend you for your honest report that looks at the challenges that you face, that you've not made much progress with the faculty. I commend you for being with this new study, this NSF initiative to increase the numbers of students and faculty in STEM areas. You know that your percentages have not increased over the last 5 years for the most part. And that, quite frankly, among administrators, while you've had some progress with Blacks in certain areas, other populations, Asian, Latinx, and these are the same issues we face on my campus. What I would tell you that's most important, though, is that when looking at your culture in science from the data, I can compare where you are compared to the country. In the country, you might be surprised to know that only about 32, 33% of whites who begin with a major in science and engineering will graduate with a degree, bachelor's in science or engineering. For Asians, it's only 41, 42%. For Blacks and Latinx, it's about 20%. Your number for most of your departments is about average, which means really bad, to be honest with you, for whites. You see 25%, 30%. At some point I saw 40%, 40. But as a rule, most of your science departments, that means 25, 30% of your white students who begin in those majors graduate in those majors. Now, many people will say, well, that's about average. I would say that's bad for all of us, especially for those students who came with the dreams in that area. For Blacks in the country, about 20% will graduate. You are much worse than that. You are abysmal. You have many strengths, but I just, in the spirit of the Empowered University, to say we can do so much better. And I want to challenge you with all of your intellectual power here and your goodwill that you can do much better for whites, but really much better for Blacks and Latinx. Those kids come in and they do not remain in the STEM areas. And so what I want to do for a few minutes is talk about the Mile program and what it means, and about one or two of the approaches that we've used. And I will tell you what you do to help one group can help another group. What we learned from working with the Mile program has helped us to change the culture of science on the campus. If you get a chance, look at my TED Talk. It's on the 4 pillars of college success in science. And what's significant is that we talk about high expectations, building community. It takes researchers to produce researchers, and we must have rigorous evaluation. And the expectations at the beginning, not just expectations of the students, expectations of us, the professoriate, of the university. I would also suggest you read, there's an article that my colleagues and I wrote, a chapter in a book entitled Social Change, the Theory of Social Transformation and Change, which focuses on minority student achievement. If you go to my homepage, you can see any of these articles and the books we've written. But here's the point, that the MILE program is based on the notion that you want to find students who have the preparation to succeed in science with support. The program began for African Americans. It now, for legal reasons and other reasons, is not just for African Americans or minorities. At least 35% of the students are white and Asian. And these are whites who are interested in the issue of underrepresentation. There's a legal issue about any Black scholarship. But if a program is designed to help people from underrepresented groups, we can attract Blacks and Latinx, Native Americans, and whites and Asians who will work on those problems, and talk about race, which is a very challenging topic in our country. And one of my questions to you as a place working to be empowered is, to what extent are you empowered to make sure people are having the tough conversations about race? They are tough, but without that difficult, challenging conversation, we don't really make progress. And what I would say to you is this, that the Mile program began with those tough conversations. Why is it that African Americans were doing so poorly in science? Background is a part of it, but can we find students who can succeed? And how do we help the students with background issues? Two things. One, we've done much more with K through 12, particularly with our Upward Bound programs and others, to get more students to succeed in science and math. And at the heart, I would say, of performance in math, because math is at the base of so much. Word problems, those same word problems I was doing in church at 12, listening to Dr. King, were important when talking about physics or chemistry or engineering, because we don't express problems in numbers, we express problems in words. So reading skills are critical. And so a part of the work I did with the National Academies, and when I chaired the Obama Commission on Education for African Americans, the critical point about looking at pre-K through 12, reading skills, math skills, those kinds of things along the way. But for the Mile, building community, having a cadre, having a bridge program the summer before, courses in math and science, but also a course in culture and race for all the students of all races, because we all need to understand these issues. Why is it that a University of Oregon would be interested in more diversity? I would think because your state wants to become more diverse if it is to be a real player in the world scene, because the world has become far more diverse as we go back and forth. I like to say on my campus that we look like the Plaza of Nations at the UN. And it's the international diversity, but it's also Black and Latino kids from this country. The combination is what America will be about. And so I want you to look at the 60 Minutes piece on the Mile program, and it will give you a sense of how we build community among that group and how it takes faculty being involved. That programs that really work academically need staff who are committed, but they also need faculty who can be mentors and champions, and to have students in their labs doing the work. And I would say, and the advantage for us at this point is we are able to attract more money from federal agencies, from donors, simply because we have a brand for showing that we can give them great return on investment. And the Surgeon General is one, the past Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, was a Mile kid who had never seen a Black doctor, came from a rural part of Maryland, went on and got a medical degree from Indiana, grad degree from Berkeley, became the Indiana commissioner, and then ended up being the Surgeon General. And the fact is, had done quite a bit of research in biochemistry with that process. But we have become the leading producer of African Americans who go on to get MD PhDs in the country. And to put that in perspective, if you look at our articles and issues in Science and Tech, Harvard was #2, but since 2000, they have produced 17. Since that same point, we have produced 42. And they are now in faculties at Duke, out at Stanford, and other places. So the key here, as you think about what you want to do, is number one, to look at ways of improving the performance in general, of looking in the mirror. And number two, I invite you to think about starting a Mile High program. We've replicated programs now at Penn State, which has some of the issues you face. If you look at Penn State, which is primarily white in that region, now they've attracted Blacks and Latinx and low-income kids and just kids who are good in science to be a part of their program. Chapel Hill, we're in the process right now of replicating the Mile High at Berkeley and San Diego, heavily for Latinos, but also Blacks, with funding from Chan Zuckerberg. The other funding came from Howard Hughes. Now, with that said, 2 or 3 strategies that I think are important. Number one, course redesign. If you look at our Robowsky Innovation Fund, and they used my name when I had 20 years as president to raise money. We have an endowment so that faculty can experiment with ways of improving performance. We started in STEM, but now it's in the social sciences, in the humanities, in writing courses, ways of using technology, of group work, of interdisciplinarity, of applications in the community. And so we make a really big deal out of these prestigious innovation funds for faculty to give them some release time and to work on building relationships on the campus and off the campus, and in working to improve the performance of students. The other one that I would mention that's really important would be all of the first-year programming that we're doing now for students to give them a much stronger experience than before. And everybody does that, but I suggested to our colleagues, and I suggest to you, that you look at programs around the country to see what the results have been, because evaluation is the name of the game. I want to stop by talking for a moment just about 2 examples that I think are inspiring. I want you to write down the names of Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, Corbett, and Dr. Caitlin Sattler, Sadtler, Caitlin, Kaitlyn. These are 2 leading NIH scientists, women, 1 Black, 1 white, both from working class, middle class families, one from rural North Carolina, one from Frederick, Maryland. Caitlin Sattler graduated from UMBC, went to Hopkins, got a PhD, postdoc at MIT. She now leads the NIH study on asymptomatic patients and doing it globally. Look at her TED Talk. It's on healing the body, but it's a fabulous TED Talk on science by a young woman. And she's got twice as many hits as I have. She's 1/2 my age. She's in her 30s, and she's got 2 million plus hits. But look at it. It's fascinating. And the other person who also gives me goosebumps is Dr. Corbett. She has become the first Black woman to ever create a vaccine. I want you to think about that. Even I can say, before this happened, I'd never even imagined the idea of a Black woman creating a vaccine, because there'd never been one. If you've not seen it, you don't even think it. And it's symbolic for me of what I'm saying to you in general, that we must see more success, bring about more success, so we can even consider the possibilities. This young woman says one day she'd love to get the Nobel Prize. We've never had a Black get the Nobel Prize in medicine or science. She may do it. I have another student who has just gotten the top Young Investigator Award in neuroscience in the world, Dr. Zarasa at Duke. He may get it. So a part of our vision in thinking in bold and hairy ways, as Jim Collins says, is that we'll produce the first Black to get the Nobel Prize. Well, we're on our way with this first Black to create the vaccine. She created the Moderna vaccine. Google her and you will see it. My point to you is this: commitment, resources, honesty in where we are and where we need to go, pushing the envelope to be better than we thought we could be. All of these are most important as we think about who we want to be considered empowered in a time that is more challenging than ever. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with you to continue the conversation. We had a half an hour earlier today, and it should have been 3 hours, I could see immediately. So I really appreciate it. I also want to reach out to the DEI staff who have put this together, and thank Vice President Alex Asenso for inviting me to the party. I've been watching this series, and I've been inspired by each and every one, really. They've been transformational leaders in academics across the country. So it's nice for me to be able to participate, and I guess I get honorary status as a scientist talking to a scientist. So I appreciate you being with me. One of the things that we talked about is, even right before you came on, is to give it to us straight, and you've done that already. And we want to keep doing that. So as we invite all of you to ask questions, there's a Q&A button on your on the Zoom thing, and please submit those, and I'll be able to relay those to Dr. Hrabowski as we move forward. So much to think about already, but I think we can dig even deeper on some of these issues. And I wonder, I'm going to ask them, I think, some challenging things, because they've been in my mind for the last year. Sure. A lot of times we talk about diversity as just being a moral good, or it's our responsibility as an institution. I wonder if you could speak to diversity as an essential part of what it is to be a strong university, yes, especially in the modern era.
Sure. No, it's such an important question. We are preparing students to live in a world that will consist of people different from themselves. I don't care what group it is. People are going to be so different in so many ways. And university graduates are leaders. And if we don't give people the opportunity to get to know people different from themselves, first of all, and to appreciate the strengths that every group brings to the table, we do a disservice to our families, to our students and our families. If people come into the university and leave the same way, thinking exactly the same way, I don't care what group it is, then we have not really done our job. That education should be, in some ways, painful, because being the light, getting the light is always difficult to deal with. When I was being hard on University of Oregon out of love, when I talked about being abysmal with Black students in science, you should know that even though we're considered best in class at UMBC, we still have a problem with certain groups of Black students in certain science courses. We're still having to be hard on ourselves. And it's about the diversity of understanding that diversity goes beyond just among the races, it's even within the races. My African students are different from my Black students from this country, and my Caribbean students are different from Caribbean American. And Latinx means many things. You've got some very wealthy people, Cubans, and you got others who may not be, for example. And so understanding the broad range in humankind, understanding how people can think differently and come to answers using different approaches. But most important, understanding that when we bring these different perspectives together, and we hear different ways of solving problems, the problem solving becomes richer. We saw that with financial institutions, with gender diversity, when all of a sudden the research showed that boards, corporate boards and financial institutions that had at least 3 women had much better financial results. And so I'm on the T. Rowe Price board. All of a sudden, if we didn't have 3, everybody got 3 very quickly. We see it as we talk about other groups, LGBTQ, when we talk about people from different religions, when we talk about people from different parts of the world, and we talk about immigrants. People are bringing different perspectives. And the research shows very clearly that those diverse approaches to solving the problems can make a big difference. I will tell you, Dr. Corbett Kismikia, the young woman who's 35 and created the vaccine, majored in biology and sociology. And my College of Arts and Humanities wants me to make sure I mention that every time, because she says that a part of her solution, of her success, has been really having opportunities to use the sociology and understanding sociocultural factors involved in health disparities. And so when it was time to talk about who's willing to take the vaccine, she was the voice saying, you don't have enough Black people and Latinx people in the samples, in the trials. And if you don't have them in the trials, you don't know that they're effective for those groups. And as a result, people are going to have even less confidence in that process. And her having that social science background another kind of diverse perspective, not just the scientific, her coming from rural North Carolina, all those different perspectives added to her ability to express what they needed to be doing in solving the problem of COVID-19, just as an example.
It's terrific. And it'll be very interesting to see how that career develops and the recognition goes. It's obviously been an important story.
By the way, I should say, and I didn't mention it, but diversity in the curriculum, and this is why diverse faculty, though, that people address issues in very different ways. Historians today are very different. The discipline of history, you know this. I was looking at some of the work, I was looking at some of the recent work of Jim Moore that he's done, because he has always looked at issues involving African Americans in addition to others, in addition to the work he does with medicine. But the fact is that you have more historians of all races now who are re-examining what was said by historians years ago. If you've not seen the Netflix, we all are doing Netflix these days with Zoom, Amend, A-M-E-N-D. It's got some brilliant work from a layman's point of view on the evolution of our country, looking at four major groups: African Americans and slavery with Frederick Douglass, all the way to the women's movement, to LGBTQ, to immigrants. And they've got historians and legal scholars throughout it. It's worth looking at. And it makes the point about diversity without ever having to say it, that our country has become so much richer with all these different groups coming to the table. And the historians and their interpretation has really has us rethinking. We're rethinking how we viewed the 19th century, how we viewed leaders, and most important, how we should view where we are today.
So one of the epiphanies that I had over the last 9 months, yet another reckoning, racial reckoning in this country. People have to stop dying for us to have these racial reckonings, for sure. But I've had a lot of conversation and I've valued them, is thinking about culture for faculty. And I came to realize that we will have the right culture for faculty of color when we have the right culture at the University of Oregon for all faculty. That was a bit, not a grand epiphany, but it's something that I have felt deeply. I had another one today talking to you, and I want you to expand on it a little bit. And you touched on it, but I think everybody would love to hear a little bit more of your thinking, because it's somewhat of a radical idea. And that is, it's this canary in the coal mine aspect of students of color. And we are failing our Black science students because we're failing all of our science students. Do I characterize that fairly? And I wonder if you could expand on that.
I would say several
where
things.
you come to that conclusion.
Sure. I would say several things. Number one, you are certainly 2/3 of your white students are not succeeding, and therefore you are failing them. They are not succeeding, and they're leaving science. And I guarantee you, when you look at the grades, you'll see why they're leaving science. Number one. Number two, yes, you're failing 90% of Black students, and almost that high for Latinx students. But there are two things. So they're not doing well in science, and they're already in a predominantly white setting that may have good intentions, but still is trying to figure out how to give them the most wholesome and welcoming experience as possible. And this is something campuses around the country are grappling with, from the most prestigious to others. And one of the challenges is we as universities are a microcosm of the world, of the country. And so when you think about it, most people of one race have never been in the home of the people of another race. Most people in our country, they've never sat to have dinner together. So we don't know each other well, whether it's Latino, Black, white, whatever. And you're putting people together. And so this is still in many ways an experiment. How do we figure out how to help make people who come from underrepresented groups, who may not have been from generations in this kind of setting, to feel not just welcome, but a part of mainstream? This is why we talk about this theory of culture change. And that means that we all have to change in different ways. Too often we think, well, the students have to do this. More and more now we understand we've got to figure out some things that are different. And what I like about the fact that this series comes out of what students were insisting upon is you did listen to them. Let me say that. You saw what they were saying, that we need these understandings to understand more about race and these kinds of factors in a society that's not comfortable. I'll say it again, talking about race. And I got that today, that people can be nice, but they're not comfortable talking about race. We can talk about sex before we can talk about race, because you see everything on TV these days. Wait a minute. But I mean, it goes from historical, from all the way back to slavery. I would say to you that we have to find ways of helping more to succeed in science, but even as they succeed, to see if we understand what they're going through. If you're the only one looking like you, it is a challenge. I remember taking some of my colleagues at UMBC years ago, some of my white colleagues in science, men, because at that point it was heavily men. It's better now because of our advanced program, another kind of diversity we are involved with. But I will tell you, I took them over to an HBCU and invited them to spend the day there. And these were guys in their 50s and 60s. And they said everybody was nice to them, but that when they came back, they just felt there was something strange about it. They had never been in a situation where they were one of the only ones looking like themselves. Now, these are men, successful scientists in their 50s and 60s, and they couldn't stop thinking about it that evening. I said, if you feel like that, think about what a little Latinx student or a Black student, American Indian student feels who's 18 years old and comes into that. You know, it's just, it takes a lot to get to that experience. And it's more about, and then even what a faculty member may feel if they're the only one. This is why there's a new report out, by the way, I wanted to mention that just came out in the last day or so from the Chronicle of Higher Education. You have to subscribe to it, but it's on diversity in higher education and on structural racism. And call me shameless, but we are one of the case studies in there on what we've done to increase the number of faculty. I know you're doing some things with postdocs right now, which is good, but it talks about our STRIDE program, but it gets into some of those issues. And I would say, so yes, we're failing whites, but it's not just the science failing, it's the overall experience that the student is having for a Black kid, for a Latinx kid. How do we help them to feel more a part of this? And that's what we talk about in this theory of change, to get them involved in helping to solve the problems, which is a part of what they're doing when they say, let's have the workshops and the lecture series, which is important.
So let me follow up on that. I'm going to combine a couple of great questions that have been coming in from folks. And one is, how do we create that environment? So what, do you have some specific recommendations? And then we have a lot of faculty on here. Sounds, people are really leaning into the work. How do we create systems that allow them to succeed in the work and to be rewarded for that kind of work? How have you structured that within your program?
Very, very important. I should tell everyone that your university is very wonderfully demanding. So I had these meetings all afternoon, and now my voice is gone. I should have had the keynote first, because now my voice is gone. But it was great. I got excited about the other meetings I was having. So please excuse my voice. The first thing I would say is the notion of building community. I was very impressed with faculty who began to agree that we should ask the question, why is it that so few students are succeeding? And why is it that our students of color are doing even worse? And what can we do? So there were two things going on. We started the MILE program, and I encourage you to look at that, of a program to, even as a pilot. We started as a pilot. We had 20 kids in the first program. We now have, in any given year, 300 and some students in that program, but we've graduated over 1,000 who've gone on to get PhDs, MD PhDs, grad degrees in STEM. And we would be doing more. The more money we get, the more of them we're producing. But most important, we now have groups like the Meyerhoff who may not be the highest achievers, but who are still succeeding in science and getting a master's in biotech or whatever. But it began with a community of students to understand their experiences, to understand more about what's the background the student needs. Because you're going to find that minority students, even well prepared, may not have had the same superb science background that a privileged student, a very privileged student, has had. I mean, the most privileged would have had AP and AB and BC calculus in 10th and 11th grades. Then you got a kid coming from rural Maryland or inner city Baltimore who's had the best experience possible in that school, and maybe it's a calculus course, but it's not a strong calculus course, you see. And so there is a range. You get my point. And especially because a lot of our students have parents who work at NSA and other places, they're off the charts. And so you have that competition going on. But when you can create a community of students who will support each other, look at the 60-minute speech. It talks about that support for each other. And then if you can have faculty who are allies, who are wanting to understand the experience, to see what's going well. and to look at the structure of like a Mile High program as Chapel Hill did, as Penn State did. And then on the other side, I saw the question about diversity of methods of teaching. The chemistry department was the first to begin the Chemistry Discovery Center. Look at our Chemistry Discovery Center. The Dean of Science now was the chair of chemistry. And we literally doubled the number of students who were succeeding of all races by rethinking the first and then second year of chemistry. One of the things we do, even for students who have 5s on AP chemistry, is to insist they start with the first course. Because when we do the analytics, and that's another thing, using the analytics to really analyze the data and trends and disaggregating by groups and by sections of courses, we found that even students who had 5s on AP chemistry tended to get a B or C in organic. And we also found that students who got C's in the first 2 years of science rarely went on and did well in science. So we even experimented having some students retake courses to give them a stronger background. Some of those students who retook courses, who got high C's, retook the courses, did much better, and they've gone on now and gotten PhDs from the Ivies in chemistry, and biochemistry. But what I'm saying is this: the Chemistry Discovery Center was the first model of group work, rethinking the way the class is configured, real problems out of our biotech companies on our campus, using technology, every student having a role in groups of 5. You got a provocateur, you got a technologist, you got the facilitator, you got all these roles, and they change roles. Nobody can sit back and be cool. And that's a major part of the course. A part of the course lecture, but a lot of it, this active learning. And it worked so well, we went to the next year of chemistry and we worked in the other sciences, but it's now in psychology, it's in writing courses, lecturing is just a piece of it. And we know, as the research says, nobody can concentrate in a lecture for more than about 20 minutes, according to the neurosciences. You fade out. So the more we can do other kinds of approaches to the work and more exchange and more activity, the more likely the student can succeed. And you can pull in. And the other thing we did deliberately was not to allow friends to sit with friends. We mixed it up to make sure so that every table looks as diverse as possible with all kinds of kids, just to give support. Now, it does help with Mile High that Black kids and Latino kids get a chance to have some experiences together, but they also learn how to work with other people, just as my white students learn how to work with students of color. We need opportunities for both, to give people support, but also to make sure we're mixing it up and having the good conversations.
I think you definitely touched on this, if not completely covered it from your point of view, but I did want to follow up with another question about a lot of the things that you addressed are like best practices for emerging practices for science education per se. Yeah. Do we need to be thinking about specifically from underrepresented groups in how we're structuring our educational programs in this respect?
You know, I think given that we see so many students of all populations not doing well in science, I really do find that having a program that brings in students from different groups and giving them a noble mission, that we're not doing this just so students can survive. These are efforts to make sure students thrive, soar, and become leaders in the field. Leaders in the field, because if you want students to really get excited about it, they've got to know there's something with something that's prestigious. In other words, as the psychologists tell us, the worst thing we can do is to have a deficits model. We've got to have a strength-based model. What do underrepresented groups bring that everyone needs to understand? Whether it's about the experience of being one of the few in a classroom and the strength one has to have to handle that well, or it's about understanding about disparities, academic achievement gap, health disparities, or it's about looking at how people have overcome obstacles. There are all kinds of strengths that people bring to the table. Or it's about explaining what's strange about this environment to me as I come from DC or whatever. What's different about this? Because I was told today, I was really surprised that you got Black students who come from all over to Oregon. So, being able to understand what they experience and what it would take for others to come is another way of bringing in more people. You can become a brand. I'll tell you a state that's done well. University of Iowa has done well in bringing Black kids there in mathematics and some other areas. Iowa is not exactly what you'd call the model of diversity, but they've done a really good job at the university of bringing in people and getting a brand for being a good place to go for grad school and for people in creative writing and things like that, from math to creative writing. And so it's that notion of building on your strength, bringing in underrepresented groups and others. They are whites who want to understand these issues. We should be building that cadre of future white faculty who have a chance to think about race while they're still in undergrad school. This is what we do with our white Mahoffs. And so now that they're on faculties around the country, you look at their labs and you'll see such a diverse group. They know how to pull them in, kids of all races. This should be the future of scientific research and workforce development.
You're making me smile because I'm thinking of especially some of my Black colleagues in upper administration who have emphasized this positive framing, especially specifically for me in the way that I use my language and the way that we think about programs and what is brought. So Danica, I know you're out there. I know that you're shaking your head right now. Let's get back to the way you started your talk, which it's clear that you know, a lot of what you bring as a leader is built on the truth of your own lived experience. And being able to speak to that, you can give us 2 minutes and then all of a sudden we understand where you're coming from. We have a question that basically asks to think about that personal experience a little bit more. And you know, as a 12-year-old, you and your peers basically confronted incredibly racist Alabama laws.
Yeah.
So now at this stage of your life, when you look back, how do you feel about that at such a young age, and how has that shaped the way that you work in the world today?
Sure. I often say to people that the experience of being empowered as a child to feel that I could have some direction, some guidance in my own direction, that I could have an impact on a society when I was 12, taught me that we should never underestimate children, that they can think well, and we can help them rise to the occasion. We have a special program on our campus, and ours is a middle-class campus next to the airport, very suburban. You can see downtown Baltimore from the roof, but from the other side of the roof, you can see towards DC. It's right there in the middle of Baltimore and Washington. And I tell you that because we bring 500 children on campus a week. We've been doing it 30 years. It's as old as the MILE program, our choice program. It's for first-time offenders, children between the ages of 8 and 15, non-violent crimes. Often it will be children who were taught to sell drugs when they were 11 and 12. And this is in Baltimore. Now, Baltimore is a city that has this irony in that you've got the underprivileged and these challenges with poor children, white and Black, but heavily Black. And then you've got one of the most educated Black populations in the country there in Baltimore because of the Maryland system, the Hopkins system, and also doctors and lawyers. And all. So you got this dichotomy. Now, why do I tell you that? Because we bring these kids to campus for 2 reasons. One is to give them the possibility of knowing what might happen if we can get them on the right track. And we've been doing it 30 years. We've served 10,000 families. And we work with them on reading and math, but more important than that, on a sense of self. And that's what the civil rights movement did for me. It gave me a sense of self with my parents, with my church, that I am someone who has the ability to have some impact on my own future. And we want our children to feel that. And the better I can read and think and solve math problems, the more power I will have. And that's so that civil rights approach to youth development is what we use with children and with college students to get them thinking about really being the masters of their fate, you know, this as much as possible. And with that said, isn't it a shame that we still have structural racism in our society? And we do. And we hear people saying white supremacy is the #1 challenge in our country right now. I wrote a piece for the Baltimore Sun with the Secretary of Juvenile Services to talk about structural racism in the juvenile services system, that a white child and a Black child, both 12, commit a crime. The white child gets off and the Black child goes to jail and gets a record. Over and over. We have the data that shows that. And it's a structural problem that we have to deal with. And some people were upset that I would get involved at that level. And I said, but shouldn't universities be involved in our society in the humankind issues that we have to face? And nothing is more challenging when thinking about structural racism than the achievement gap and the numbers of young boys of color going into the criminal justice system. And so I bring all of that up to say that comes out of that foundation that was laid for me by my parents and by Dr. King 50 years ago.
Great, thank you so much. Right before we came on, President Schill and I were both joking about which one of us would resign to make space for you here. But do know that we are listening. And a lot of the reason for that is the things that you're saying really resonate with me, of course, maybe given our very different backgrounds, but same perspective through the lens of science and education. One thing that we talked about briefly in our earlier time together was the importance, and you actually asked for data. Coming into a talk, you said, what is your data?
Yeah.
So could you talk to us a little bit about the role of information, data analytics, and how we can actually do rational decision making as we try to address these problems?
A very good question. Very good question. We've invested quite a bit in our decision making and analytics group. The fact is that we first have to create a culture that says, we're not doing this to point fingers at individuals. We're doing this to seek the truth, to understand how different groups are doing and what practices are effective with students, for example, what practices are effective with faculty in mentoring and making sure people get to tenure. What's happening if people are leaving? I saw where you had some of your Black faculty to leave, more likely to leave, but the numbers are small, so the base is small. I understand that. But the fact is that we disaggregate the data, but we give this capability to people at every level, not just at central administration, but at the departmental level and in units. So we can look to see what's happening all the way to the level of specificity of courses and sections. Give you just one example. We wanted to understand when the engineers say too many students are having a problem getting through that first couple of years of calculus, of the math they have to take. And then looking at the first couple of courses by section, by faculty member, by race of students, by gender, to understand what's happening. To see who's doing the best job, what can we learn from those people? Not to embarrass anyone, but when you find great variability within one course across 10 sections, and and the students have been randomly distributed, and you see that in some sections only 40% are getting a C or better, and in other sections you've got a much higher percentage doing well, then you have to ask what's going on here, and how do we come together to understand the challenge. As I've gone to different universities and I've asked them about this, it's rare that groups get together to look at the trends, to look at who's making it, who's not. And it's not because anybody is against it. It's just that we haven't been accustomed to doing it. But I'm saying any place that really wants to improve must be able to look in the mirror by looking at the data to understand who is succeeding, who is not, and if they're not succeeding, why? Because I say qualitative and quantitative assessment. Yes, the data and analytics, but then focus groups. If you've had 12 students of color leave a major in the last year, why not bring them together to understand why they left? To look and to see how you can be supportive of them in that process, quite frankly. And then in looking at how people teach, if we're only giving a midterm and a final, and people don't get the exams back or don't get enough feedback, they don't know whether they're doing well or not, you got another problem. Because in high school, kids get a lot of feedback. And yet in colleges, so often, we don't give that much feedback. And by the time we give the feedback, it's too late. Because here's the point that we never talk about. If I'm a student in a calculus course, or in a chemistry course, or a physics course, and I've earned a D at midterm, it's just about over, because one thing builds on another. And if I didn't get a strong foundation in that first half of the course, it's just about over. It really is, unless there's great intervention. And that's where we work to look at ways of intervening, to look at what are the concepts they didn't get, even if we have to keep moving, how do we have supplemental sections and ways for people to still grasp those concepts so that they can keep moving ahead? Because that's the point about STEM education. One area is is building on the one below it. Similarly, in the other areas, your reading skills develop in languages. I'm studying French right now with my students. J'étudie le français chaque jour avec mes étudiants. Many of them are first language speakers in French, and they love correcting mon prononciation. But the point is, you learn one thing first, conjugation and verb and those, and you move from there. And if you get into the reading, there are layers of understanding. Same thing in STEM. In music, same thing, right? So the point is, we need more specificity in the use of analytics in understanding where the students are getting caught and why they're not doing well, how that relates to their background, how strong was the background from high school, how much are they studying. I'll give you just one example that makes the point, excuse me. We started having students record how much time they're spending working together and how much time they're spending working alone in the Chemistry Discovery Center. Students came to me after, and then they have the grades there. They have it written down, not by name, but you will have, they can look, go on their laptop and see the people who had the largest number of hours of studying with groups and others and their scores on tests, and then those who just studied by themselves or didn't study as much. I actually had students come to me and say, we think it's very unfair. I said, what's unfair? I mean, they're trying to make it seem that if you work much harder, you necessarily get better grades. And they were upset. And I just laughed and I said, are you a college student here? You're a BC? Yeah, it's true. The harder you work, and when you work with people, you do better. But they honestly thought there was something unfair about that system. But the idea of feedback on all those levels, so that it's almost metacognitive, thinking about how you think, thinking about how you study, very important as we experiment. And that's what I would say. Because as we've done well in those course redesigns, after a while, we start having challenges and needing to redesign and continue to do it. It's the idea of constantly experimenting to see what's working this year and over these several years in a pattern.
It's great. The one phrase that came to my mind, it just popped in my head after our conversation earlier, was that we need to do good, not necessarily feel good. And that arose from just some very clear statements you made about the Meyerhoff program in terms of who gets into the program and what criteria you use. It's potentially not particularly fashionable, I guess, in this day and age. So I wonder if you could talk about that and why you have that kind of structure.
Sure. When we started it, we had people who thought it was unfair to start something for Blacks, though we had never had a Black graduate in science with above a 3.0. We had a couple who had high 2.9s, and if they could get a 2.9 or so in Black in science at UMBC, they could get into med school because they were considered far better prepared than kids coming from minority schools with much higher grades. And they were the best in kind that you could find, quite frankly. And they went on, did well. But we were not accustomed. We had never seen a Black earn an A in an upper level science course before Meyerhoff. And when people, I've said an African American, kids who come from other countries who speak French or who are British more in orientation, who pass the level 1 exams in England, yes. But Blacks who grew up in DC or New York, no, we had never seen it. And we needed to understand what the background needed to be. And I did talk a lot about W.E.B. Du Bois and the Talented Tenth, which was not popular at that time. People thought of that as being elitist. I said, yeah, but the Talented Tenth would be millions of people. And they say, well, the highest achievers are going to do well anyway. No, they don't do well anyway. They go to the most prestigious institutions and they don't succeed. That's not just Black. In fact, what our study showed with the National Academies was that the more prestigious the university and the higher the test scores of the institution, of the person going in, the greater the chance that student will leave science in the first year or two. And the reason, I mean, this is at the most prestigious of places. Now, some make it, but many do not. In fact, when you ask our audiences that question, how many of you started in pre-med and science and ended up becoming a great lawyer? People laugh and raise their hands all the time. That is an American phenomenon. I said that, and the general counsel for one of the most prestigious institutes in our country said, you just told my story. I had a perfect SAT. I went to the most prestigious of all institutions. I got a C in chemistry, and I changed my major to the humanities because the people were nicer. I was getting A's, and I figured I must not be good. It happens all the time. It's the secret we don't talk about, All right. So the idea of being honest about what will it take to help more students getting at least B's in those first 2 years of work and getting them into research labs. Very, very important. But I would say what we learned in STEM, let me just say, has been helpful across the board because we built communities also now in the humanities, in the social sciences and others, based on the notion of giving the highest achievers these opportunities to go to become even better. So our humanities scholars and our artist scholars, Linehan artist scholars, we've got endowed programs and built on the Mount program for other disciplines. Why? To create a culture that celebrates the life of the mind. Public universities are known for sports. They have high achieving research faculty, big places. I went to Illinois, but they're known for sports. When you think about privates like a Carnegie Mellon, you think brain power. That's the first thing you think. But we want it to be different. We are very nerdy. We're very proud of that. All right. We were the national champions in cybersecurity in 2017. We shocked ourselves by making history and beating UVA in 2018. And we were the first time ever in the history of NCAA, a number 16 seed beats the number 1 seed. The funny part about it is most of my students really didn't care because they're so nerdy. They didn't understand it. So we do well in serious theater. We've been to the Kennedy Center 7 times, winning the American College Theater Festival. Beckett is our muse. We do deep, dark theater, right? And the science students and the social science students are involved in research. Undergrad research is huge on our campus. Two journals for undergraduates, and then a lot of kids who publish in referee journals with faculty members. But so the selection process, yeah, we're looking for the highest achievers to make it because we want to make them much better than they thought they could be. Now, as a result of that, some college elitists, we now have another tier of good students. They may not be the highest achievers, but we have a same kind of community, and some of them even move to that other group. And most important, we say with high achievement goes high responsibility. That's what gets you away from the elitism. So all these students who are my house or in the BUILD program from NIH are working to serve children in the community. They're teaching math and science and reading and being mentors. And that adds to their role as building the university's outreach to the larger community. That's the approach that we use.
Great. 2 more questions, I think, and then we'll let your voice recover. One is, we've talked a lot about, and you just mentioned it. Actually, I have a question from a lawyer who is asking about these Weeder courses specifically. Do we need to restructure them? Do we need to have multiple pathways in? Or you just talked about, well, we do need to actually make sure that the people can succeed who we're going to be investing in. So how do we find that balance? How do you see that structure? We have several people who have said, what do we need to do to address that issue, and how do we take that on?
Let me tell you, and I can't say this most, shared governance is one of the topics on my book. You see there, academic culture change, shared leadership, we say in academic success, giving faculty opportunities with students and with administrators to have the hard conversations, to listen to the voices of students, to see where they are, to do the analytics, to see what's the relationship between the preparation the student brought in, students' habits, effectiveness of teaching and learning, what do we see with different groups, and most important, how can we redesign courses and give people different options in that experience? And that does require, though, to be fair to faculty, professional development time. We spend a lot of money on faculty development, on grants to allow people to redesign courses, on experimenting. This is what innovation means. Understanding some things may work, some things may not work. And what I love, though, was when we were doing it in science, when my colleagues in humanities, and I said, we want some of these innovation grants. We want to change course. Let me just give you one great example. The department Jim Moore comes out of history. It's just been phenomenal on our campus. He helped build it. And it's hard. I mean, faculty have left us to go to places like MIT with full professorships, on Oregon and to Vanderbilt and other places. But the point is that just one example of an innovation course that you appreciate. This is from faculty just talking. During the time of Freddie Gray, the Black riots in Baltimore in 2015, we were looking at ways of bringing the curriculum into the conversations about race and poverty and racism. And a history professor and a computer science professor got together and developed a course on the Civil War, Pratt Street War of 1861, and compared that war to what was happening. It was happening in the same part of Baltimore as the Freddie Gray riots. And you got kids in the class who are descendants of slaves and slave owners in Maryland. And the computer science people were going to help the historians make it into a game that high school kids could use. So it became a gaming problem using history, looking at themes of poverty and tension and race and violence and those things. And you play the game as a fox running through the streets. Now, imagine what that takes for those two professors working together, then having history students learning more about coding, coding students learning more about history, all of them understanding more about what was happening in the city right now. And it is a rich experience, and using our Imaging Research Center to make it happen. So a number of courses of that kind where you bring in real life experiences with STEM work. The mathematics of being human is another example. If you can imagine a course for first year students, the mathematics of being human, and students of all races, and bringing in problems involving math and stat, and the fact that in inner city, the asthma rates for children much higher than in suburban areas, the quality of the air, and then connecting that to literature involving. So the idea is that the more we can give faculty the chance to be creative and thinking about pulling students into the work, with the chemistry, of course, and with the math is more problem solving. It's all about just problem solving and learning how to work in groups and learning how to ask questions and learning how to explain concepts. And then once you get them to that point, then getting them into labs, you see. So, I mean, bringing faculty and giving them that space to create and try has worked really well for us over the years.
Great. Well, I'd like to wrap up, obviously, with what is definitely a life signature of yours. It's the Meyerhoff program. And thinking about, you've seeded it at multiple institutions with support. If the University of Oregon were to think about trying to move down this direction, what would you recommend? What would our steps be to achieve that?
Sure. I would mention Mike Summers, who is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He is on the cover of my earlier book, Holding Fast to Dreams, with one of his three-dimensional structures of HIV. He has identified several parts of it. He's a Howard Hughes investigator, and he is passionate about this work and goes to places to give 2 talks. This is what you call commitment to diversity. He will only go to places who will want him to give first a talk in his research in biochemistry, but then a talk on diversity initiatives and what he's worked to do, and because he runs the diversity graduate program in biochemistry with the Downtown Medical School, and he works with us with the undergrad Meyerhoff program, but he also leads the replication effort with the campuses in California, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So that his name, if you Google the name Mike Summers, first-rate scientist who is passionate about, if you go to his lab, you'll see as many people of color as anybody else, as many women and others, and he's got 20-some people in his lab. We have a whole floor for him as Howard Hughes investigator. But secondly, we've written an article, the presidents and the scientists involved in those 3 campuses, UMBC, Penn State, in Science, that came out a year or 2 ago, that gives wonderful analysis of what we did, and with a lot of backup work. Third, we've got a lot of, you just go from Meyerhoff's program, you can see all the articles we've written. And fourth, I've got colleagues who are more than happy to talk through some of it. And then fifth, I'm going to say again, he may not be on this call, but you can get to him. He's there. Cliff Pudrey. He's a world-class.
He's on.
I mean, listen, you are really lucky. I mean, you could probably get him to do something for fairly cheap, I guess. Let me not say what it would, but he is world-class, and he's right there on your campus.
That's good. Well, you've inspired all of us. I got to say, the president's already called me multiple times, and I don't know, you haven't had a chance to get to know him, but once you get him excited, he's excited. He's excitable, even more excitable than his dog Max, who chewed on your book.
Well,
so that's high praise from Max, obviously.
Patrick, may I leave you? I have just 3 lines.
Please do. Yes, some final thoughts there.
I started with my hero, heroine, Maya Angelou. And I'm now in love with Amanda Gorman, who was the young Black woman, the poet at the Biden administration. And her last 3 lines, again, I get goosebumps a lot. I get goosebumps. She says this, and I say this to you, University of Oregon: the new dawn balloons as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. And then she says, if only we are brave enough to be it. Something we've ever heard, be the light. There's our challenge to all of us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you again. Part of the story that we heard is how many different schools you visited just even in the last month.
Yeah.
I think that the 12-year-old Freeman would be looking at you now and seeing not only did you move the world at that moment, but you have spent your entire life moving the world, and you moved us this evening. So thank you again so much.
Thank you very much. I'm honored. Thank you, Michael.
Let me just also offer my gratitude. I've already reached out during your talk in the chat to Dr. Pudrey, and we're looking forward with a high level of excitement to learning what we can learn and maybe trying our own version of the Meyerhoff program. So
excellent.
Thank you for inspiring us.
Thank you. Thank you. So proud of you. Keep doing the work. We can all be better. My line is success is never final. Got it? Thank you. Keep hope alive.
And thank for everybody who joined us tonight. We really appreciate your support and interest, and lots more to come.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.